Tomatoes?
Like tomatoes, yeah. Too sure.
Good morning, sir. Good morning.
I'm not in yet.
Yes, you are.
Volume, my
Mute yourself.
volume.
Call the meeting to order. This is the Reagan Hanford Cleanup Board meeting in October 23rd, 2024. I thought today we would start with introductions. We will start on this end of the table. We will go around, followed by roll call to establish a quorum. Then approval of the May meeting summary, land acknowledgement, and then we will get into the content with the U.S. Department of Energy. So Matt, if you introduce yourself, quickly go around the room.
I'm Matt Hendrickson with the Oregon Department of Energy, Radioactive Waste Remediation Specialist.
I'm Sarah Lovetang with the Oregon Department of Energy. I'm just working on the natural resource damage assessment.
Hi, Tom Cecilia, the Hanford hydrogeologist and
Good morning, Mia Burke. I work for Hanford Challenge on the board.
I'm Laura Feldman, Portland, Oregon, and I serve on the Oregon Hanford Board.
Tim Seymour from Emerging Water Research.
Hi, Max Woods, Assistant Director for Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness. I am Director Gene Benner's designee for the Oregon Hanford Board. Thank you for all for coming here.
Jeff Lloyd, I'm the chair of the board, member of the public.
Steve Benwick, Vice Chair of the Board of the Public.
Mark Reese, staff, Oregon Department of Energy.
Patty Stitzel, member of the board.
Michael Freeman, private citizen, member of the board.
Someone would think so. You member of the Oregon Cleanup Board and Open Fleet.
Yeah, it's Jim Doherty, Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board and your HAB representative.
So before we get to the back row, I'd like to welcome Esteban Ortiz as our youth member of the board. And Esteban, can you give us just a very brief summary of your background experience and why you're on the board?
Yes, definitely. I think, I was telling Gary this morning, I think, used to be on the HAD. Now I moved to Oregon and working with Columbia River Keeper and the Hanford program. But definitely, that's one of the big things I think with all the issues happening right now. And council, I think it's an interesting time talking about Hanford.
Great, thanks. So Gary?
Gary Younger, Department of Energy. I'm Ryan Miller, Communications Manager for Department of Ecology's Nuclear Waste Program, sorry, Washington.
Stephanie Plank, also with Washington State Department of Ecology and Program. Susan Coleman, private citizen and chair of the advisory. Project manager.
Okay, thank you. We're going to run through the roll call now. Tom Roberts. Laura Feldman. Mia Burke. Jim Doherty.
Here.
Stephen Bedrick. Here. Aaron Ashley. Senator Hansel. Senator Gorsuch. Representative Levy. Representative Gamba. Patty Stitzel. Michael Freeman.
Here.
Esteban Ortiz. Here. Okay. So the next item on the agenda is approval of the May meeting summary. Mark sent that out with the agenda. Any changes or additions to the meeting summary? And I would add that it's it's little more than an outline at this point because the actual meetings are available online. So if anyone who wants to get into detail can see the recording online, which is why we kind of script the meeting summary down to estimates. So any changes?
Yeah, and I should have emailed you back. I think on the attendance list, I was submitted. I was at that CPR.
We'll make that change.
Okay.
Okay, Laura?
We acknowledge the land our building is on as the traditional territory of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Warm Springs and Yakima Nations, as well as the traditional fishing grounds and gathering place of many Northwest tribes and bands. These Indigenous people have enduring and current relationships with the land, including public lands and spaces where cities, towns, farms, ranches, and timberlands have been built and managed by settlers. We recognize that Native communities were forcibly removed from the land where we now reside and the continuation of harmful colonial legacies. We recognize that our denomination led to colonization of this region, causing untold harm to the Indigenous peoples here. We recognize that these actions disrupted Indigenous peoples' relationship with the earth and its natural gifts, causing hunger, disease, as well as cultural and spiritual poverty. We realize that a land acknowledgement is an evolving and persistent process focused on facilitating continued learning and growth. With this acknowledgement, we hope that Indigenous people see themselves represented, respected, and valued in all learners' benefit. The Dallas First Unitarian Methodist Church is committed to a continued relationship with our Indigenous neighbors and partners. We recognize and honor these people as the sovereign stewards of this land and valuable members of our community. This was written by lay leader Sharon Thornberry, May 2023.
Thank you, Laura. So we are already ahead of schedule. Gary, DOE is up first.
Brian Vance is not yet joined, watching here, so. Anybody keep popping on, just got some movements.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like a suggestion on the first two of Raleigh bills. Could we, if possible, try to have time stamps, start with the sections? And so that when we, try to make that part of it.
You just want timestamp to have it?
Yeah, just so that like for each main topic, so that you can open a fast forward. Easy. Start there. Okay.
So Brian Vance is just joined.
So Brian Vance, welcome to the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board.
Thank you. Great for the opportunity.
We appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today. So with that, we'll turn it over to you and your presentation.
Oh, great. I thought I was a little bit early, but I'm glad you're a little ahead of schedule, so that works out great. So I appreciate the opportunity. It's been a long time since I've given a bigger picture view of the Hanford site to this board. So I'm glad to be able to walk through the really exciting time we have in front of us, and frankly, what we've accomplished recently for Hanford. If you go to the next slide, I'll just start with a little bit of an overview just to make sure we're level set. The site itself, 586 square miles, about 50 miles of the Columbia River run through the site. You can see out around sort of north of the river and then east of the river, the Hanford Reach National Monument. That's managed for the most part. There's an area along the Columbia River that we still manage ourselves, but mostly managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife under a permit with the Department of Interior. The northern part of the site on the reach is really active, is open, boat launches, hiking, those types of activities. The Rattlesnake Unit, which is on the western and sort of you can see the highway kind of runs through there on the Ale Reserve. That is not open to public at this point. That's been an issue for several years because of the nature of that part of the site relative to the tribal nations and their sacred, their views of sacred land. So that's not open now. We are having discussions with the 4 tribal nations about a co-stewardship approach for that part of the Hanford Beach National Monument, still in discussions. And we'll continue to work through that process and also share when we can whether we get closer to an agreement in the coming months. The mission, as stated there, is very clear. I don't have any other missions here other than the cleanup mission. There's no other national security mission. I'm not providing plutonium. I'm not doing anything other than cleaning up the site. And this is an EM only site. So other sites in the country, there's 14 other cleanup sites in the country. Many of them are co-located with Office of Nuclear Energy, the National Nuclear Security Administration, other organizations. This is not that. We are EM only, and so the site is under my purview, the entire site. You can see the range of activities we execute, from treating groundwater on the very large scale, 2 billion gallons per year, through soil remediation, traditional demolition, to construction in the range of a new water plant for potable water up to the nuclear facilities that we're building to operate. We look at the site in 3 basic product lines to provide some framework to it. One is the tank waste treatment and disposition product line. The second is we'll call it risk reduction product line, which is more of the traditional groundwater demolition, soil remediation type of activities. And the third is base ops and infrastructure, base operations and infrastructure, which is really everything else: water, power, sewer, roads, security, fire department, all the things that are required for us to execute and manage a site that's as large as some of the counties in the state of Washington and other states in the Western United States. And then the leadership focus areas are important to recognize. Those are the elements that we've maintained stable for on the order of 6 years here at Hanford, to make sure that we could lead the transformation of the site that we've been executing. So health and safety of workforce is always our top priority in everything we do. We are in the transition to an operations-based site and vision for the future, which is really a reflection of the transition to waste treatment plant operations, but more broadly in other areas as well. We want to serve as a fair and demanding customer to our contractors, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the future slides about the commercial structure of the site. And then we are actively engaged across a very broad spectrum of stakeholders, from local to state to regional to national level, as well as the tribal nations, to strengthen relationships to support the mission and the cleanup mission of the site, really to gain as much alignment as we can. And then underpin all of that is really a teamwork model that we've put in place here on the site to create the conditions for success. So all of those things together, I think what we've been able to lead this transformation so far. And as I mentioned, there's 15 EM sites in the complex right now that are under the Office of Environmental Management. Hanford's the largest and most complex by far. The second site is Savannah River, which is about a half from a budget perspective, and all the other sites are generally much, much smaller. And if you actually look at the first 12 or 13 sites from just a dollar amount, then we add them all up, they don't equal Hanford. So if there's a major league site in the complex, we're it. So that creates some complexities in the execution mission that are not always common across the other sites.
Hey,
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have a number of new people on our board. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your role on the Hanford project?
My background, you mean?
Yeah, introduce yourself to the new people on the board.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. I just assume I've been here so long that everybody knows who I am. So I thank you for that. So Brian Vance, I'm the site manager for the Department of Energy. I'm the senior DOE official here at the site of responsible for the cleanup mission of Hanford. My history, I graduated from Penn State University in the 80s, 1983, with a degree in meteorology. I immediately went into the nuclear Navy and became a submarine officer, so I really never used my degree in a way that was, I gave really good weather observations from the periscope, but that was really the extent of it. I was in the Navy for 25 years. I retired in 2009 in the rank of captain, and I transitioned to acquisition. So I was a major program manager and acquisition program manager for major submarine programs my last 6 years in the Navy. I went to work when I retired for Arriva, which was Framatome or Orano, depending on the current way the company was broken up after about 10 years ago. In the new plants world, so I was trying to build new nuclear power plants. The one we were focused on was in Maryland. After 4 years, I moved to Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. I was the AP1000 product manager. So the new nuclear plants being built or that have been built in Georgia. And then in China, the AP1000, I was the product manager to find ways to deliver those plants more efficiently. I left Westinghouse in 2016, came out here to Hanford as a contractor for about a year and a couple months. The 324 building, which I'll talk about a little bit later, was my project on the site. And then I had the opportunity to come back into the department in 2017 as the manager of the Office of River Protection, which was the tank waste mission part of the Hanford cleanup. I came directly in as the manager, as the lead for that organization. And then in 2019, in February, I took over as I was dual-hatted as the Richland operations manager, which was the rest of the Hanford site, and the ORP manager. And I stayed in that role until 2020 when my position was formally combined into one. And then 2 weeks ago, we actually combined the two offices. Now we're the Hanford field offices. So I'm responsible for formerly, as I was before, but for the single enterprise the department runs here to manage the cleanup. And I'll talk about the little pieces as we go, but that's my background and how I got here. And along the way, I got a master's of business administration from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. But most of my experience in the world that we live in now came from being a Navy nuke and then in commercial side and major capital projects.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful.
And I'll pause after every slide to answer questions along the way. I know we have plenty of time, and Hanford, even for an hour or so, is a speed date. So I'll be happy to answer questions along the way so we don't lose the thread. Okay, next slide, if you would. So everyone wants to talk about the Hanford budget. So I'll start there. Upper right is the cleanup budget that we've executed from 1989 to 2023. We've received about $65.8 billion in cleanup funds from Congress. We are fully and only funded by Congress. There's no other funding sources for us. If you look at the upper left, you can see the budget growth between 2022, 2023, 2024. There's always talk about inflation and whether our buying power is increased or not. In some ways it's not, but on the macro side, $3 billion is a lot of federal money to come to our Hanford site. And I don't think our budgets would be continuing to increase if we didn't have the confidence of Congress to continue to progress the mission constructively, safely, and effectively. And then from an employment perspective, from a manpower, I'll just go through manpower numbers at the top line. I've got about 300 federal employees on my staff here. My staff is supported by about 200 support contractors. So my staff as the Hanford site manager is about 500. We oversee the work of our 6 contractors. They employ between 9,000 and 10,000 people combined. And then when you talk about the badge count, when you see the 13,000, that includes the subcontractors that our primes hire to do different scopes of work across the site. And so from an employment perspective, Hanford site, we generally talk about 1,000, 11 to 12 to 13,000 employees. We're the largest single enterprise employer in the Tri-Cities. Pacific Northwest National Lab, which is just on our southern border, about 6,500 employees at about $1.5 billion. I suspect Cadillac, the medical provider for a lot of the region, they're probably in the same size as the lab, so 6,000-ish folks. So Hanford is the largest employer in the Tri-Cities as a site. And then it's important to recognize we subcontract through our prime contractors a fairly significant amount of funds every year, about $500 million to subcontractor small businesses. So if you look at the economic stability of the Tri-Cities, a lot of those small businesses here grew up supporting Hanford and then have diversified. And so we provide effectively that economic foundation for the growth of the Tri-Cities in the future as well. So we take that very seriously, the DOE contractor partnership team. And that partnership we have with our community is really important to our success as well. So it's all kind of tied together, and that thread at the end of the day is really through financial support that we receive from Congress to move the mission forward. Any questions on this slide at all? And we are in a CR, as you know, through December for now, and without any impact on our plans for the site.
Brian, this is Max Woods. Thank you for this. Since we're talking about money on this slide, what are you thinking for FY 25, 26, 27, next coming years? What might be your expectation if you had sort of a crystal ball looking at congressional funding? Would you expect it to be, a steady increase as you've seen on the slides here since the last 2022, 23? Or might you see a flat budget? What are you thinking of that?
I think it's going to be increasing. I think, we've completed the holistic agreement with the state of Washington and EPA on the way forward with the tank waste mission. I know that you're going to get some of that brief later from Stephanie in her presentation. But to meet the obligations the department has taken on with the holistic agreement, our budgets are going to need to go up, and that's largely to support the construction for the high level waste facility going forward. In addition to the transition to operations for the direct feed low activity waste portion of the waste treatment plant, but going up is our estimate.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Next slide. This is our lineup. As I mentioned, the Department of Energy now is just that single enterprise at the top there, between this Hanford field office. And this slide really underpins an enterprise approach that we've transitioned to over the last several years, framed by I'll say the phrase One Hanford, which we introduced in January of 2020 after I'd been in the year of the combined seat for about a year, and saw the need to look at the site fundamentally differently. Instead of two islands within the cleanup mission on the Hanford site, really a single enterprise. And then the pandemic hit, which it kind of solidified and helped in some ways solidify our way ahead. But this is the current lineup. Washington, go around clockwise. Washington River Protection Solutions, that's our tank farms contractor. We started the transition to the replacement contractor on Monday of this week. It's called H2C, and I can't remember the acronym. It's an LLC led by BWXT with partners Amentum and Fluor as the main partners. There's some other partners that are smaller players in individual roles. H2C will take over the tank farm scope from Washington River Protection Solutions over the next 120 days. They will also ultimately take over the waste treatment plant for the direct feed low activity waste portion after hot commissioning is completed. So they have a two-step transition. That second transition won't occur until, I would estimate 2026 sometime, maybe as late as 2027. When hot commissioning is complete and we're ready for that second transition. Until then, below that, Bechtel is the constructor of the waste treatment plant. We'll continue to operate the waste treatment plant through hot commissioning until that point where they transition to the new contractor H2C in the future. And they will continue to construct the high-level waste facility under that contract even after they've partitioned the DFLAW portion off to the other contractor. iKnowMedic is our occupational medical provider on the site. they're within the first year of their role, and they're doing a phenomenal job, really carrying on the tradition that our previous occupational medical provider performed at. Navarro ATL operates the 222S laboratory. It's a small business enterprise that operates the lab that does most of the radiochemical work associated with the tank waste upstream of the delivery into the direct feed low activity waste program. They also do some work for, they did for the Central Plateau contractor with 100K and the basin when we dewater, things like that. But their primary customer is the tank farms team. Central Plateau contractor, they are really the traditional cleanup contractor. So they'll have groundwater, building demolition, remediation. They'll have the 324 building, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and also have the waste encapsulation and storage facility effort that will start next year to move those capsules from wet to dry storage. I'll talk about that a little bit as well, a little bit later on. And then the Hanford Mission Integrated Solutions contractor, they are the site integrator between the contractors, but they also provide site services that are site-wide services that we can buy once and have them broker the resources like craning and rigging, the Hammer Training Center, the fire department, Hanford Patrol. They all fall under Hanford Mission Integrated Solutions contractor to provide those site-wide services. HMIS in the current contractor took over in 2021. CPCO took over in 2021. Navarro took over in 2021. So they're here for a while. And then, like I said, Washington River Protection Solutions is kind of on the way out now. And Bechtel will be here for a while. And then the other two contractors, Inamedic's pretty new. So that's sort of the contractual lineup. 6 different contractors under 6 different contract types. Our role as a department is create the conditions on the site at an enterprise level for the site to be successful and the contractors to work together within that model to be successful as well. Any questions on the commercial lineup here at all?
Yeah, I have a question. I hadn't really put it together till just now, but yeah, that's a lot of turnover in the contractors in the last couple of years. Yeah, is there a particular reason? I mean, it sounds like all of them basically changed in the last couple of years. So
yeah, part of it is the way the federal government does contracting, and there's a periodic refresh approach that the federal government applies that we've gone through. HMIS, CPC, and the Navarro that the lab executing 2021, we're trying to use, there's a little bit of a natural stagger that's occurring now, which is helpful because we don't want to do it all at the same time ever again. And so we're going through that now. The Washington River Protection Solutions contract, they're in the 15th year of their 10-year contract. That took a couple of iterations for us to get the integrated tank disposition contract awarded. But if you look at, it's just the way the process works. The players, they become competimates in some ways. BWXT, Amentum, Fluor, Bechtel. You see various, in some competitions, they're teammates, in other competitions, they're competitors. And so there's always sort of a thread of some of the same corporate enterprises as part of a lot of these solicitations. And again, because Hanford's unique, we have a little bit of an industrial base role to play in the complex as well. So there's, we're going to have multiple contracts here as a means, frankly, for the industry of building talent and experience for some of the other sites as well. So it's complicated on a couple of different dimensions because of that, but you're not wrong. And it's been a heavy lift for us over the last 5 or 6 years to get through all of these solicitations. And luckily now there's a little bit more of a stagger because we're almost ready to start the next phase to go back in to start planning for future transitions, because it takes us several years to get through the process.
Yeah. I mean,
There are a couple more questions.
Yeah.
And to follow up on that question, and like you said, it's Hanford CD. And when it comes to the federal contracting, I think the big thing also that it's nothing but contractors. So where do like the welders, pipe fitters and everybody kind of fit like you said, starting the next phase, and I'm thinking, okay, this budgeting, right, and what Congress allows. With this, how is it gonna affect the next process, but it's still kind of, how are you gonna meet your goals if all these folks are really new to the process?
Well, what typically happens in a contractor transition is the leadership level of the contractor changes out, but the workforce generally stays on board. And so the contractors go through a transition process where they'll offer all the people that are working generally below the senior executive level their jobs to stay in the jobs. The benefits are generally pretty consistent. And so you don't see a lot of turnover in 90 to 95% of each of the companies when there's a transition, because the leadership team is where the transition really occurs. So we don't see a lot of fundamental shifts in the workforce when those transitions occur. And then really from a work perspective, they're picking up and taking on the work that we've already worked over the previous couple of years to get Congress to fund. And so they're not going to come in with brand new ideas and fundamentally change the way we're doing business or the activities we're executing on the site in a transition. They're going to take on what the previous contractor had, and then over time, they'll have opportunities to shape and innovate, working with the department if we see opportunities to do some of those things going forward. But so we don't see any major perturbations in the labor force. We don't see any major perturbations in the non-represented workforce. And we're about 40 to 45% labor represented. The rest are on the other end of that spectrum, not represented by labor. And generally, we haven't, most of our folks have kind of been through that a couple times. So there's not really a big emotional, other than a little bit of the unknown. And the transition periods are really where the company leaders come in and talk about the transition. The good part for Washington River Protection Solutions is Amentum is a partner in the new contract as well. So the workforce knows Amentum is a part of the future workforce, and that provides some of that mitigation as well. We don't see people leaving jobs in mass because of a contract transition in general.
I'm sorry, could you clarify presumably the contracts come up periodically and are open to competitive bidding, and the incumbent company in these cases chose not to bid or was underbid by another company?
The incumbent in this case moved into a follow role by another company in the same limited liability corporation. So they'll, and then the other competitor had different competitors, though even now, if you look at Washington River Protection Solutions, Atkins was their partner. Atkins was a partner in the losing bid with other LLC members, and Amentum, who's the lead now, went into the second role with BWXT in the winning bid. So, like I said, it's a different corporate enterprise, but Amentum didn't bid for the work as to retain the work like you would look at if a single contractor in a world where there's individual contractors with scopes of work. You would have an incumbent who would likely bid for to retain their job, and then you would have others trying to take it. In this case, it was a little bit of a mix and match there. And that's sort of traditional for the way the Hanford site, the big contracts end up getting structured, with the competitors in certain areas and partners in others. That's just the way it's kind of played out.
Okay, any more questions before we move on? Laura?
So I'm trying to understand the one Hanford team, and wondering if you could put EPA and Washington State in that mix. How do they figure into the team? Are they at all involved in hiring contractors?
No, they have no role in the execution of the Hanford commercial or federal role here at the site. There there are partners from a regulatory perspective. but they're external stakeholders from the enterprise perspective.
Okay, I think it'd probably be best if we moved on to the next slide because there's detail later on in your presentation. I think we'll want to do a deeper dive into that.
Sure. So I could spend, this is our engagement arena. I kind of framed that from a stakeholder perspective. I could spend the rest of the time talking about the engagement arena we operate in here, but this is basically the, I'll say the simplified view of the parties, organizations, enterprises, government agencies, tribal nations, corporate enterprises, et cetera, that have an interest or engagement in the Hanford site every single day. And so we, you know, if you look at this broader perspective here, we are working as a Hanford team in all of these areas every single day to ensure that we have awareness of the work we do, build support where we need to. You can see there's a split between the federal agencies in the yellow color and the state agencies in blue. And somehow the blue got a little bit, with the titles, got a little bit juxtaposed there. And then the gray is sort of more the broader local level, and then the purple is the tribal nations. And so when you think about stakeholder management, tribal management, and working to across this entire spectrum to raise awareness and support and execute the mission, this is what we focus on as a Hanford leadership team with our contractor partners every single day from to create the conditions for success at Hanford. So this is probably not a surprise to most of you, but I just it's helpful at least to see the breadth and scope of the stakeholder environment we work in to create good outcomes at Hanford. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Brian, GAO, a couple of months ago released a report, and I'm going to quote something out of the report. It says, DOE officials at the Hanford site have shifted their focus toward communities in close geographic proximity at the expense of wider regional concerns. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because obviously here in Oregon, that sort of a statement is concerned about.
Yeah, what was that statement in?
The GAO report.
Oh, yeah, my favorite GAO report. Yeah, good.
Early in the summer. I know there's multiple GAO reports. This one was more specific about engagement with communities.
Yeah, my sense is that was based on, you know, the GAO is really good about pulling things out of context and throwing them into their reports that are interesting but not always factual. I will just tell you that we work across the entire spectrum of stakeholders. I suspect some special interests maybe were concerned about the fact that we weren't doing the traditional state of the site events that we had been doing in the past. I would tell you that I thought those state of the site events as they were previously structured were intended for sensationalization. And frankly, they weren't they were dishonest way of getting people to get a perspective on the Hanford site. Wasn't given the fair treatment to the department or our regulators to have a constructive and respectful conversation. And so we shifted out of that approach to business because it was no longer constructive, no longer, I viewed it as inappropriate and unproductive. And so we've done a number of different things, relying on virtual as well in a number of cases to ensure that we were getting the information out to people and engaging in constructive ways. But there's always those who look for different venues and different approaches. I will tell you, we have I think we have a good relationship with Max Woods. We support the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board. We support the state of Washington and the regions across the state. We've done outreach, and we have done what we call open houses, or I can't remember the right term for it, but we've had over the last several years meetings out in the community. Post-pandemic, it's been a little bit slower to get started again, so that's where we began our virtual. But I would tell you, we spend more time in engagement than my predecessors did. And I think it's showing the fact that we're out in a broad range of activities and events, and people are more aware of Hanford than they have been in the past. I just think it was a comment taken out of context by probably a special interest group who had an interest that wasn't being met.
Okay. Brian, thank you for that. This is Max. And you can imagine that the report raised some concerns with probably everybody in Oregon and Western Washington read it. You kind of read the words in the report and go, wow, that's not been my experience, but what are we missing something? So, I will say, I appreciate the note you said. I do think we have a good relationship. And I personally haven't seen any sort of change in the engagement between you and your team and us. And Gary's here in the room today. You're speaking to us today in this presentation. I appreciate the time. And we have asked to come to the site over the years or have you support these meetings. I think we've had good response and sort of good relationship there. But of course, you read the report and you sort of start scratching your head and thinking, are we missing something? Is there a change in posture or policy that we're not aware of? And it sounds like from your position, that's not the case. I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
Any additional questions before we move on?
We might. Ryan, did I notice from your camera there that you're having a little trouble hearing us?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, we might need to speak up a little bit when you're in the back of the room.
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, next slide. So just a little bit of cleanup history. The site hasn't always enjoyed a good reputation for the progress being made. A lot of that was centered on the waste treatment plant. I can talk about that later. But if you look at the facts and data, the cleanup history since 1989 is sometimes underappreciated. So just quickly, we have 9 reactors here along the river. 1 is a national park. 7 are in interim safe storage. We're down to the last one, K West reactor. We treated 34.8 billion gallons of groundwater. We treat 2 billion gallons per year. We've retrieved 21 underground tanks. And if you look at the broader story, we've retrieved Sea Farm years ago. We completed AX Farm this year, and we've started A Farm retrievals. So retrievals continue, and we have a good track record of performing those retrievals on schedule. Shows 640,000 gallons of tank waste ready for immobilization and glass. We'll start our next batch for the tank side cesium removal system within the next 2 weeks, and by the end of the year, I expect to have that number is going to be over 800,000 gallons of treated tank waste ready for the waste treatment plant next year when they're ready to start receiving waste. And then 1,000 waste sites remediated, 966 facilities, and in parallel, built the capacity to start treating tank waste next year with the waste treatment plant. So, the history it can be a little bit checkered at times. The strategic, I'll say, conundrum that the department took on with a waste treatment plant project that was a one-of-a-kind, first-of-a-kind with an unproven technology was, I'll say, a challenge, going to be a challenge, turned out to be. But the history for that investment made by Congress so far, we have accomplished a lot, and we've set conditions for really the future cleanup as well. We've already turned that page to the new chapter. But it's not easy, and it's complex, and it's challenging. And so I like to have this slide in the presentation overall, just to give people a better sense of what has been accomplished. Because if you come out on the site and you tour, we now have historical markers up in places where we completed cleanup, so people know what we did, right? The 300 area, which had over 200 facilities, all gone except for 324 building and 325, which is P&L still operating. The rest of it's cleaned out. 61810 waste site remediated. Each of the reactors in interim safe storage, and all the work around the reactors to remove all of the infrastructure to support them. Groundwater program that, in the nation is unparalleled. All those things are a part of this cleanup that is not always recognized. So I just use this to kind of ground everyone on. We have accomplished a lot, but it's hard, it's challenging, and periodically we've stumbled, but the team here dedicated to the success of this site and this mission is committed and really talented. Any questions on a little bit of the history?
That's the one.
Yeah, hi, Brian. The big thing is that, right, like you said, and again, you mentioned Congress and budgets. And as a public, that's a big thing to understand, right? Like, what's the milestone? So it now, like what you mentioned right now with the situation, with technicality, but what would you say for to continue this process about educating the public about those milestones and where you at with the process right now and everything that's going to happen?
Well, we're in conversations now with ecology and EPA a little bit. I mean, the conundrum we face is, and I'm just going to be frank, the milestones that were established over the last decade or so, there was this misperception that milestones equal money, and that's not true. Congress doesn't look at it that way, and there was a drive, and I'll say the department and the regulatory agencies kind of did this together. Didn't look at the site as a single enterprise, didn't look at the site as a single integrated risk management problem, and created these milestones which were not risk informed to perpetuate some scopes of work that, from my perspective, don't even cross the threshold for representing a risk to our workforce, our community, or the river. And now with the holistic agreement in place, which defines the top cleanup priority for the Hanford site as the tank waste mission, and the money that's going to take to execute that portion of the mission within an agreement that the department, state of Washington, and EPA have just agreed, we're going to have to look at the other milestones across the site and rationalize those against the risk profile. Because my role here and what I believe is our biggest focus area has to be investing dollars to drive the risk profile down as quickly as we can. When we do that effectively, we're creating the safest workplace for our workforce. We're creating the conditions to protect the community and the river in the most efficient and effective way. When that gets sub-optimized by chasing milestones that may not make sense from a risk profile perspective, then the decision I'm forced to make is making people less safe. And we all have to come to grips with that as we look at Hanford going forward from where we've been in the past. Site's getting older, time is our common enemy. The things we choose to do now have to be based on the risk priority they represent to our people, the workforce, and our community first. As we clean up the environment, and when we do that well, then everybody wins. That's going to be sort of the next phase of the conversation about the Hanford cleanup is, can we get alignment on what that risk profile looks like, then realign the milestones appropriately to align with that risk profile so we can all support the cleanup as it's framed, I'd say more broadly. Misalignment is tough. And if there is misalignment, Congress doesn't want to send money here. Congress doesn't send money here, then we do less, and nobody wins in that. So that alignment's going to be important. Those conversations are going to be important. I'm not sure when they'll go into the that next phase. Once we talk to EPA and ecology a little bit more, we'll have to have some more of those conversations and then start to socialize that with a broader audience over time.
I'm going to follow up to that. That's really interesting. I think I might be missing something. Can you get a little more concrete about which milestones you're seeing as not being? I totally hear what you're saying. I'm just curious, what are you seeing as milestones that are not highly risk aligned that you would maybe put, if I'm hearing you right, put on the back burner to focus on the tank stuff first? So like what specifically are you thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about there's 40 or 50 that are already in abeyance. That's the first place to start. Canyon demos, those canyons aren't falling down. They don't represent a risk. Those should be pushed out decades before we go and attack those. There's some of the studies that tie to some of the groundwater work that we have to phase in a more logical sequence to align better with the overall risk profile and the funding profile we expect to see. And that's why some of the conversations about compliant budget, you know, Congress is going to give us what they're going to give us. They give us funding because they believe we can safely, efficiently, effectively, and predictably progress the cleanup. And no scenario in my world, or at least my view of the world, has Congress given us $4, $5, $6, $7, $8, $10 billion, which is what the milestone picture would sort to indicate. So they become irrelevant at that point. So that rationalization process we need to do to look at the site as a single risk profile that we're managing within the funds that Congress can provide us, within the agreement that we all reached on the tank waste mission. Looking at the rest of the profile is really going to be important for us to get that alignment, because without the alignment, then we're not going to have the confidence in Congress to continue to move forward. And you know, $100 million swings here, that's a lot of people going home. That's a big impact on our ability to execute the mission. And so we've got to get past this sense that there's a confrontational or a negative relationship between the department, regulators, the state, the region, the community. Everybody's going to get on board. We're not going to satisfy everybody, but if everybody can see the logic in the approach, that's where I think we're in the safest place to progress the mission as we build it over the last 6 years. And frankly, that's the success path that I think is most important for us to work together to achieve.
Brian, we're in the process of reading through and digesting the most recent GAO report. Can you talk a little bit about how GAO fits into the decision-making process for the site?
I'll say peripherally. I'll be honest, you know, the GAO came out with something recently that said we should pause the HLW facility until we go do some other stuff. We're not going to do that. We have a legal obligation to move forward. We're going to do that. I think it's an input to the process. I think, you know, if we have questions we have to answer to members of Congress, we're happy to do that. But the GAO has no direct influence on what we do. It's really just another source of advice that we have to consider as we choose our way ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I did notice in the last report that DOE agreed with 2 of the 3 major recommendations, but the regulatory agencies disagreed with all 3 of those recommendations. So just wondering how much weight is put on that by the agencies in the decision.
We generally have had conversation with the agencies when the GAO comes out to make sure that we all understand how the game's going to have to get played. Sometimes it's difficult for the administration to not concur, but how we interpret and what we do based on those inputs within the range of concurring. We'll manage that to make sure that we can execute the mission. That's the sort of the thread we always have to kind of weave through the needles that we thread every day.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next slide. We're ready. Just a big picture view, just for geography, just to give a sense of what the tank farms mission looks like. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. This is really just about geography, but in the background, you can see Mount Rainier and Mount Adams. If you're looking west, in the foreground is the 65-acre waste treatment plant. And this is an older picture because if you look to the right, you can see the liquid effluent retention facility. We now have another basin that we built over the last couple of years. So this is just for overview. You can see the tank farms out there. Blue are the double shell tank farms. Green are the single shell tank farms. So at a macro level, in 200 East, which is adjacent to the waste treatment plant, 11 tank farms, 91 tanks. Of those 91 tanks, 25 are double shell tanks and 24 are in service. If you look out to the west, that's about 5 to 7 miles, depending on where you start your journey. 7 tank farms, 86 tanks. Only 3 of those 86 are double shell tanks. And that'll come into play when you have the conversation with the state on the holistic agreement. The 1 million gallons of additional tank capacity unspecified, so we have some latitude in how we're going to construct it. It's likely, we intended to be out west to give us some operational flexibility when we're out there in the tank retrieval program. And 3 double shell tanks out there. And then if you look to the right, the liquid effluent retention facility, basins there, and then a little farther right off the picture is the effluent treatment facility, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's another part of direct feed low activity waste and all really part of the tank farms complex that we're executing at the site every single day. And I'll talk more about the tank waste product line on the next slide. Any questions about the geography or how it's all laid out? All right, so next slide is, I'll say the introductory slide to our tank waste product line. So this will just be a little bit of a discussion when you slide it over on direct feed low activity waste. The holistic agreement, again, I know you're going to get a conversation about later. At the macro level, the agreement went out in the documents in draft on 29 April. We conducted the 3 public comment public meetings in July. The public comment period ended on the 1st of September. And I think Stephanie will talk a little bit more about the details, and I can as well if it's helpful. For direct feed low activity waste, this is the plant or a picture of melter number 2. The plant at the waste treatment plant for the direct feed low activity waste part of the plant is in commissioning. We literally started our cold commissioning management assessment on Monday. That's the precursor to start of cold commissioning, which cold commissioning is we inject chemical simulants in what we feed the waste treatment plant into the melters to create the chemical off-gas results that allow us to test all the off-gas systems. It's a precursor to the, you're going to get a brief later again on the environmental testing we'll do that validates that. That all is the workup to the start of hot commissioning, which was when we send tanks waste from AP 106, that 640,000 gallons that's treated, which will be 800,000 by the end of the calendar year. That's when we start hot commissioning, when we start feeding treated tank waste over the waste treatment plant. So the cold commissioning management assessment is going well. Today we're feeding melter 2. We have already fed melter 1. Both melters are hot. Both melters have been fed. Both melters have poured glass into containers. And so the commissioning process is going very well. And we remain on track to start treating tank waste in hot commissioning next year on or before the 1st of August, 2025. The tank side cesium removal system is the upstream part of direct feed low activity waste. That system is currently in an outage today. It just completed the last batch at the end of September. We'll start our next batch, which generally runs between 180 and 200,000 gallons of treated tank waste per batch. And that's what it takes to fill 2 ion exchange columns with cesium. That next batch will start within the next couple weeks, and then we'll continue to move forward there. And we have identified TSCR as a demonstration project. The follow-on project that will be the longer-term solution, we're working through the critical decision process for that. It's called the Advanced Modular Pretreatment System. It looks very much like TSCR with 1 more ion exchange column, and then basically a two TSCR set to provide continuous feed to the waste treatment plant going forward. And then I mentioned liquid effluent retention facility, the 4th basin, and then the effluent treatment facility has gone through several hundred million dollars of upgrades over the last several years to be ready for direct feed low activity waste when it starts next year. The effluent treatment facility will start its first batch this month, treatment batch. So we're on track there. And the integrated disposal facility, you can see on the lower left of that picture, that's the cooling pad that's out there for containers when they come over. The integrated disposal facility is there, ready to move forward. They're actually going through processes like mock-ups and training to build the procedures to bring the containers over from the waste treatment plant over to the integrated disposal facility. And at the macro level, we're permit complete on the waste treatment plant, 77 for 77. We're gonna have a little celebration next month with College and EPA. So the permitting side of it, there's some permit conditions we have to satisfy through the test program, but we're permit complete and ready to move forward into direct feed low activity waste next year. Any questions on DF law?
Just a comment, I think the development of the pre-treatment TISCR technology is a major accomplishment for DOE, especially given the problems from 10, 15, 20 years ago. So on getting that technology up and running.
Yeah, I'm really pleased. Literally the first week I became the manager on the 6th of November, 2017, the department made the decision to go to TISCR and to design it, build it, test it, field it, and operate it, and it be in our 8th campaign or 8th batch within my time in the seat at Hanford. That's in DOE time. That's pretty fast. And we're using technology that was used at Savannah River. And then, like I said, we're going to use the same technology and approach for the advanced modular pretreatment system. And oh, by the way, when we get to the West Farms, the West Area Risk Mitigation will look a lot like the advanced modular pretreatment system. So we want to design once and use many, again, to manage that risk. And so we're really excited about this capability. And we see it with continuing to be used here at Hanford to help us move the mission forward in multiple ways. Okay, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, one more question.
This is Mia Burke. So a recent DNFSB report, it was uploaded yesterday, but it's from September 20th. Reported that one of the canisters at DF Law overflowed, and while it was being filled and melter pour operations have been paused. Could you go into this and explain this a little bit more?
Yeah, melter one, the east, there's two discharge chutes. There's an east discharge chute and a west discharge chute. And the team was pouring waste or glass, not waste, glass, test glass into the east discharge chute. And there was they overfilled that container with clean glass, 1 or 2 inches, and I don't know how the actual number because they're still working their way through it, above the level. It was related to a system issue and a process issue that both have been addressed and resolved through a corrective action program. The melter one is still hot, still operating. We're not pouring glass out of it right now. They actually lowered the melter east discharge chute container out within the last week or so. They literally just have to go and chip the glass out, and then that east discharge chute's good to go. And the west discharge chute was not impacted by that. So I'd say it was a learning experience for the operations crew relative to how they were looking at and checking their indications across a couple of different sources to validate. We have a thermal camera, there's a weight scale, there's also timing of how long they fill. That crew missed an indication and overfilled by a little bit. The procedures worked at that point correctly. They stopped the evolution. They stopped that work. They isolated the issue, and they've worked since then to resolve that. We should be able to resolve that in the next several weeks and put melter one, the east chute, back into play within the next couple of weeks. Not a big deal.
Some follow-up questions. So did the spilled glass fuse and harden to the mechanical carousel equipment?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Did the spilled glass fuse and harden to the mechanical carousel equipment?
No, it never left the top of the melter. And it didn't envelope the bellows that are on the top of the melter either. So when they lowered it down, there was just a glass ring around the upper part. It didn't go beyond the top of the melter at all, top of that container at all.
And will there be any schedule or budget impacts?
No. Any other
Laura,
questions?
Yeah.
You guys speak up.
Yeah. The test bed initiative mass being lowered into tank SY 101, that picture that you have there, is that the leaking tank? Just.
No.
That wasn't
No.
the leaking.
Nope. And I could talk about that on the next slide if you're ready to go there. Ah, there it is. So this is, more broad. No, go to the next one. Yeah. This is more broadly I can provide an overview of the broader tank waste mission. I'll say a little bit beyond DFLAW. So we've got, the tank integrity program, which we have in place now with expert panels and reviews and data analysis and gathering that is continuing to evaluate all of the tanks to validate and structural integrity, as well as in the double shell tanks, more of a chemical management to minimize corrosion. Tank integrity program cuts across all the tanks. The T101 was the tank you're referencing in the T farm that we reported in August was assessed to be leaking about 200 gallons per year. From a risk perspective, doesn't change the risk profile of the site at all. That tank already has relatively small amount of, I'll say, drainable liquid on the order of 10,000 gallons. There's a little bit of supernate, and then the rest of it's kind of held up in a salt cake. The tank sits about 660 feet above groundwater. That's an area of the tank farms that was, had hundreds of thousands of gallons leaked during the national security mission and discharges of tens of millions of gallons directed to the soil, again, during the national security mission. It's already under groundwater management. And so there's no contamination that's, if it reaches groundwater, which takes 2 to 3 decades, given the amount we've estimated it would take for contamination that might leak out of T101 to find its way down to groundwater. That groundwater doesn't leave that area until it's treated. And so from a risk profile perspective, it doesn't move the needle. We announced it in August, and we'll continue to work with the state on actions that we'll consider taking, usually centered around making sure that the infrastructure above that tank is sealed well. And then that tank farm is already on the plan for a new cover over top of the tank farm that will further mitigate the risk that the contamination will find its way deeper into the soil. The test bed initiative is that lower left picture. This is the part of the 2,000 gallon test of taking treated tank waste from SY 101. And once it's validated to meet the waste acceptance criteria for commercial disposal in licensed facilities in Texas and Utah, we'll ship it to those 2,000 gallons, about 1,000 to each location, for them to grout and place it into their landfill. Testbed initiative actually operations are complete. We've extracted 1,961 gallons from SY 101. It's currently staged in the transportation containers that are Department of Transportation approved. We sampled, I haven't gotten confirmation of this, we were supposed to sample yesterday to validate that the constituents in the tank meet all the acceptance criteria. That process will take 120 days or so because it's a fairly exhaustive analysis process we use. And then next spring, March, April, May timeframe, when the weather is good and the test results are good, we'll ship those 1,961 gallons to those landfills. This is separate and distinct from the holistic agreement on the retrieval and ultimate treatment of the 22 tanks in S, SX, and U farm that won't begin until beyond 2028 when we're completed with our current retrievals in A farm. So tank retrievals is a part of our tank product line. Tank integrity our evaporator, which will begin evaporation campaigns in next spring again. After a couple years, we're going to do some upgrades and work through some material issues. That's integral to retrievals because to retrieve, we have to mobilize the waste. We add liquid to do that. We want to take the liquid back out to manage the space. Evaporator is a part of that. So we're the evaporator is on a good path now to move forward. Talked about the test bed initiative. And then the last picture up in the upper left is the high level waste facility. Design is progressing. Our goal between now and the end of 2027 is to get 90% design on the facility itself, which considers the direct feed high level waste decision made from holistic agreement. And we'll do some limited construction. What you see there is limited construction. That's the placement of a shield, one of the shield doors into the facility. So we're doing basically some of the work now to put equipment in the facility. They'll make construction easier in 2028 and beyond when we finish the construction phase or go back into full construction. And we're doing things into weather the building. We're looking at different roof areas, putting in lifts of concrete to weather the facility in over the next couple of years. So again, construction can go unimpeded with the weather once we get into the construction phase beyond 2028. And so that's sort of the broader rest of the tank waste mission. Any questions on that part of the mission before I go to the next slide?
And we've got a couple of questions, Mia and Laura.
Yeah, Burke. So can you explain the issue with the rusting testbed initiative totes and how that problem came about and how it was resolved?
What problem?
The rusting totes that were going to be used for TBI. Had rust.
Oh, I think that might have been just minor superficial rust on the outside. I think that's been addressed. If it hadn't been, I'd know. So I think that was a minor issue, easily corrected.
Can ecology speak to this at all?
I don't know. Maybe they can. You can ask them later. They'll be here.
Yeah, that was directed on ecology in the rule.
I'm sure Stephanie would love to talk about that.
Okay, we'll hold that question for later. Laura?
There was this, as you might remember, a couple months ago, there was a great scare about Tisker going through Spokane. The liquid waste and how dangerous that was. So it was an alert and then it wasn't happening yet. But it is ultimately going to happen. So more and more, the public is very concerned about liquid waste moving through Oregon. And I just want to bring that up as part of the record.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I mean, we're waiting. We're certainly interested in the public comment period we just completed. That will inform our decision on the future on the 22 tanks and what options we might have relative to grout first and then ship, which I think is likely, but we haven't made that decision yet. From a danger perspective, I would, this is really benign material. It doesn't mean that that's minimizing the concerns, but compared to lots of things that get shipped through DOT approved processes and containers and vehicles every single day through the interstate system and cities, the 1,000 gallons of treated tank waste with almost no radiological content and some chemical content that's pretty benign. And that information will come out as we get into, once we complete the analysis, we go to provide all those details. I think there was some misunderstanding of the nature of this material, of the treated tank waste to be shipped, and misunderstanding perhaps of the rigors that the Department of Transportation applies to really safely ship many more hazardous things than what we're going to be shipping in liquid form in the near term with the test bed initiative.
Brian, a question about future tank leaks. Do you think the public in general kind of overreacts given the risk profile of the site? Do we overreact to new tank leaks?
I wouldn't say, I think it's something to react to. I think what we've done, I think pretty effectively over the last several years is done a better job of characterizing the nature of the issue relative to the broader risk profile that we manage every day across the site, and have built, I believe, some credibility and level of trust because of our outreach and because the facts and data are presented in each of these situations. It's great for when I can go out and talk about good things happening. I want to go out and celebrate successes, but like we did with T101, that's not going to be perceived as good news. We appreciate that. We want to get out there in a timely way. We want to be transparent about it. We want to talk about what it is, what it's not, what risk it represents, what we're doing about it, and then help people see the broader risk perspective around the site. I'm hopeful that that's creating, I'll say, a more constructive relationship and reaction by people in the communities when they hear things about Hanford over time. And I think it's working. I mean, we haven't had a lot of follow-up concerns about T101 after the initial communications in August of this year. And I think that's because we are getting out there, telling our story, talking, providing the facts and data, being transparent when we have challenges and issues, talking about what it means, and just continuing to maintain the focus on cleaning up the site is the thing to focus on. We're going to be challenged, but when we are challenged, we're going to tell you about it. We're going to talk about what it means, what it doesn't mean, and we're going to continue to do the very best we can for our workforce and our community to progress the mission. I think that's working, and we have to continue to maintain that level of engagement and transparency to be successful, because Hanford's a complicated place and because it's likely we'll have other challenges in the future. I'm always planning for the next challenge, and we need to focus on that the approach to business that's helping us be more credible and be more trusted in the work we're doing at the site, if that makes sense.
Max, yep, Brian, this is Max Woods. Just on that note, I appreciated that Delmar Millions called me the day, or the same day, but earlier in the day before he publicly announced the leaking or presumed leaking tank. That's a nice touch to have that connection.
That's part of our process, and we're going to keep doing that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It gives me a chance to ask questions and fully understand the context. To your point, Jeff, how worried should we be? That helps to give me the opportunity to understand better the situation. I was going to ask you about the high-level waste construction. I think you mentioned this earlier, but do you need additional money on top of what you already received to continue the construction of the high-level waste facility? And is that in the plans to make that request of Congress?
The department has made the needs of the holistic agreement known to OMB and certainly to Congress as well. Yes.
Thank you. That's the budget funding for homes.
Okay, so product line 2, risk reduction. So as you know, Hanford's more than just tank waste mission. And so we got some really good things going on now. I'll talk about all the things that we have in play. If you look at the upper left, we have 1,936 cesium and strontium capsules sitting in our waste encapsulation and storage facility. That's one of the concrete casks being moved into the facility as part of our practice process. This is really part of the training program. As we get ready to start moving the first capsule next calendar year, probably late in the calendar year. So right now, all the equipment to transfer capsules from wet storage into ultimately those casks, and there's a number of steps they've got to go through, and they're put in sleeves. Sleeves are put into a larger structure within that cask and installed in the facility. That's all installed, and they're going through the testing program. We have a full mock-up of that entire process at our maintenance and storage facility in the 400 area that's being used for training and procedure development. And we have all of the 18 of those large casks out on the site. Number 19 is at the waste encapsulation, is at the maintenance and storage facility in the mock-up. And that program is doing very, very well, remains on track to start retiring that challenge to our site, getting capsules that are, for at least the cesium side, pretty highly radioactive from wet storage as a post-Fukushima evaluation and risk mitigation into dry storage. We'll start that next year. That process will run for about 27 months until all of the containers or all those canisters are into those larger casks. And then I'll say that remaining, that's a major risk reduction on the site. Once they're in dry storage, they'll be there for a long time. So we're excited about that. Upper right, up until July of 2024, we had about 1.2 million gallons in the K West reactor basin on the backside of the reactor, about 300 to 350 yards up gradient from the Columbia River. Pretty contaminated, had been used for multiple years for debris storage and spent fuel and a bunch of things that we ultimately cleaned all that out. In July, we dewatered. In August, that's the picture. That's the basin full of grout. So that risk is retired. And that's a major, if you think about the river corridor, other than what's left at 100K and 324 and a small site called 61811, it's literally adjacent to the waste of the parking lot of the Energy Northwest. River corridor is in a pretty good place, and we'll continue to operate our groundwater programs as well. But that was a big success for our site, and really proud of that. Lower right, we're still doing D&D work across the site in areas largely to maintain a workforce, but we've done some work. You can see it here at Redox. That's actually all done now. They did similar work at Purex, and then over the summer they were still doing some work at 100K with some of the ancillary facilities around the K West reactor. So there's still D&D work going on. I'll say limited as we look at our funding profile, but it's still progressing. 200 West Pump and Treat. I show this picture because the 200 West Pump and Treat itself went through an uprate from about 2,500 gallons per minute to 3,400 gallons per minute over this year. And so this year, for the 10th year in a row, we treated 2 billion gallons of groundwater. 5 of those pump and treats are along the Columbia River. 200 West, the 6th one is in the 200 West area, combined 2 billion. And every year we're moving wells and optimizing contamination removal from the soil. So big success story. The uprate was important because the Central Plateau is sort of a new frontier in the groundwater program. And so we see some really good results so far, and we'll continue to execute that program. And then in addition to what I just framed, 324 building, we're working through the regulatory path, but we have agreement with the EPA now on that path. Right now, the building is going through inactivation preparations. We'll inactivate and we'll demolish by roughly 2028. And then we'll continue on to the waste site remediation under that facility by about 2031. All of these are dependent on funding from Congress and all the things that you'll recognize we live by. But we have a course for 324. We're on it, and we have a path that I think is safe for our workforce, and will ultimately result in the same place we would have gotten to prior to finding additional contamination there. Supercell 11, which is part of our environmental restoration disposal facility. Design work was conducted this year, FY24, well, actually last year now. And we expect to put the first shovel in the ground later this fiscal year and have Supercell 11 added to the environmental restoration disposal facility to support not only 324, but some of the other demolition work around 100K in places around the site as we go. So that's an enabling effort that we continue to fund and continue to work to create future opportunities. Look at the K West reactor. In our current plan, given the risk profile shift that we just executed, that will move out a little bit farther in time until we get that one in interim safe storage into the early 2030s, right now projected to be completed by 2033. But from a risk profile perspective, doesn't represent anything near the risk it represented in the past when the basin was full of water. And then, as you know, in this world, the Transuranic Waste Program is going to start ramping up. We started ramping up in 24, building towards a certified program that will start us shipping again to New Mexico in 2028. We've got about 5 years of containers already prepared to be certified and shipped based on the shipping schedule that we've seen so far. We still have about twice as much to get out of the ground, package and ship. There'll be a new facility built in the 2030s to support that. That may start as early as 2029, depending on, again, the funding profiles we're working to. But the Transuranic program will start ramping up, and it will be part of the Hanford cleanup mission in earnest from 2028 for probably about 20 years. So those are the elements of the risk reduction product line, with an overall view of where we are today and where we're going over the next decade or so. Any questions about risk reduction side?
Just a comment on true waste shipments through Oregon. We look forward to working closely with you and the the communities on that route, and as that program ramps up.
Yep, no, I think that's, that's important, and we see that need as well.
Ron, you had a question?
Yeah, well, thanks, Brian, for that. The big thing you said about like the basin being full of water and treatment and seeing how much is getting treated. And of course, now working with Columbia, we're keep what effects are gonna happen in Columbia. And you mentioned risk assessment, and I think the conversations to happen. So when it comes to pumping all this water and treating this water, has anything changed on, like you mentioned, the volumes and the risk reaction about the treatment about from all this water and pumping it from the ground? Like you said about, or a
So
conversation.
You're talking about the groundwater program in general and what we clean up to, or where the water goes?
Yeah, you can start with the groundwater. Appreciate it.
Well, the program itself, it'd probably be good to get you a detailed brief from the groundwater team if you want to get into the second and third order level questions about the groundwater program itself. Each year we're continuing to move wells to optimize mass reduction from the aquifer, which is really the goal of the process, not to treat a certain number of gallons, but to really reduce the contaminants in the groundwater. And so we have an active well program. It's generally between 10 and 20 wells per year that are moved. And, that's sort of a year-round thing, better in the summer than the winter. But yeah, I would tell you that if the details, if you're interested in getting into that, I'm probably not the right person to go into the details on. But we can certainly get you the right folks and have a more detailed brief whenever you're ready.
Okay, any more questions on the risk reduction?
Leave a comment. Brian, I'm really happy to hear about the cesium and strontium casks. That's huge for me. I first learned about it on a Halloween about 5 years ago at a public hearing in the river and was properly horrified. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Okay.
No, you're welcome. We're excited about that too.
Before we move on, I know we've got some comments and questions from the public online. We're going to have to hold those. Our procedures are that we address those in public comments at the end of today's meeting. So
We'll hold.
yeah, we'll hold those. Back to you, Brian.
Okay, next slide then. So, well, I'll move a little bit faster through these because I see we're getting a little bit close on time. But as you know, it's not just about the cleanup. So it's the infrastructure, water, power, sewer, roads, IT infrastructure are all part of what we have to do as, I'll say, mission enabling to enable the cleanup mission. we're consistently and steadily investing in our infrastructure to right size it as the cleanup progresses. Couple examples, we have meteorological towers on the site, about 30 actually, that are part of how we manage some of the projects based on the conditions that can cause challenges, like with the stunning finishing plant. There were specific wind requirements that had to be met before they moved forward with some of the demolition work. And so that's a part of what we do. And then it's also standard worker health and safety. We weather conditions drive us to want to shut the site down. We have a team of weather specialists on the site, I think 6 or 7 meteorologists who support some of those conversations too, about how do we most thoughtfully either delay work or change work areas. So that's a part of the site that's not always very well understood. You can see the person standing in our new Central Plateau water plant. Actually, that's the tank. We're in the phase now of replacing the 1943 potable water plant that delivers water to our site today. So 81 years, really great plant, but it's time for something a little bit more supportable and expandable as the site mission continues. So we've got a new water plant that's being built. We should finish construction within the next 3 or 4 months, go into a testing phase, and that plant will go on into service late 2025 calendar year or early 26. And then you can see on the right-hand side, we've had a new north loop. We have power, all of our power comes from the Midway station along the Columbia River on the western part of the site. We have a north loop and a south loop that distributes the power. We worked with BPA to replace the north loop to provide additional reliability to power to the Central Plateau, which will make sure that, when you have 2 hot melters that operate based on electricity, you never want to lose electricity to melters, because when that happens over time, they become 2 big clumps of glass that I probably can't melt again. So power continuity is important, and we work very closely with the Bonneville Power Administration. They've done a great job for us, and so we see that progress as well. And then we're always feathering in, as I said, road projects, water projects, IT, cybersecurity is a part of this. All part of what we have to manage within that $3 billion plus within the risk profile that we manage, to make sure that we're doing the very best we can to support the mission, but keeping people safe as we do it. Any questions on infrastructure?
Brian, this is Max again. Thanks for that question. You probably saw this one coming, but I think it was yesterday, the day before, there was a reported power outage at the site. Any issue from that? And I suspect you're probably still looking into what happened with BPA and see if there's any consequences to that.
Yeah, they're still going through the investigation. It didn't impact any operations on the site. It's amazing to me that a small power outage in the 200 West area makes the top story in the weapons complex monitor. It must have been a slow day for them. We have worked very hard over the last several years to enhance the reliability of our electrical distribution system, but also enhanced our resilience to issues, because, like in the past with demolition projects where the site was dominated by demolition projects, if you had a power outage, as long as you weren't placing something at risk, you could probably give it a couple days and then come back and fix it. That was not generally a major impact. When we're talking about 2 hot melters, waste treatment plant operations, all those facilities, and all the water, power, sewer, IT to support it all, we've had to fundamentally change how we spare our utilities, how we staff the teams that support utilities, to make sure our response times can be accelerated to meet the needs of the site today versus what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And we've made tremendous progress. And so when you have issues like this, in general, our contractor team, working with our department, obviously does a very good job of pulling all that together, triaging, making sure that we have a rigorous, structured approach to where we restore power, where we restore water, whatever the lost utilities are, and do it in a time frame that doesn't impact operations, or if it does, minor impact. And our team has been trained and is well suited for the mission of today and the future. Doesn't mean we're not going to have areas to improve upon. And every time we have an outage like we just had, you know, my question is, okay, what did we learn? What are we doing different in the future to mitigate the risk that this can happen again? And what does that mean to our response times? And how do we mitigate this going forward? We continue to have that questioning attitude and that learning attitude, which will continue to drive us in the right direction over time. So no impact operations, minor, the power that would need to be restored was restored within a couple hours. And in reality, we learned from that and we'll be better the next time.
Thank you. Very good.
I have another question.
Laura?
I don't know if this is the place to do this, Brian, but there's been a lot of buzz recently about Amazon partnering with Energy Northwest to build 4 of the SMR modules there at Hanford. And every time I bring this up, I'm told that piece of land where the CGS is located is not part of Hanford, but it certainly is on the Hanford reservation. And I would think impacts everything that goes on there. And people are very, very concerned about this development. Who knows if this will ever happen? I know that's not your focus or bailiwick, but I think it's a huge concern and something that just needs to be mentioned.
No, I appreciate the comment. I spent 8 years trying to build new nuclear reactors in the country. It's not easy. Small modular reactors are going to be a challenge as well, and this is going to be if it's built, it's going to be a follow-on to what's being built now in Texas. And so I understand the concern. I think there'll be time to talk about it, but the time's probably not in the next couple of years. Okay, next slide. Yeah. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Stephen, go ahead.
Is the reason for that just because it doesn't seem like there'll be anything concrete to even know what the situation would be for another 2 or 3 years, or?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Next one is base operations. This really gets down to site safety and security. We have a Hanford Fire Department that is very proficient. We have cooperative agreements with the local counties and region and with Fish and Wildlife tied to the REACH. And our firefighters do a tremendous job every year, and they're trained for the purpose. We have Hanford Patrol because we do have materials here on the site that require materials, information, and facilities that require safeguarding. We've got a very robust security force here and a training academy that helps them maintain their proficiency, and they're very proficient. And then the Hammer Training Center, which is really the cornerstone of our health and safety culture focus at the site, continues to do a great job for us in giving the workforce across a set of standard training areas like hazardous material, radiological training. It's broken into 1 and 2. Types of things that many of our workers are going to see routinely in their work environments across the site, no matter which contractor they work for, get really good hands-on training on those types of things. And then from a safety culture perspective, it is one of the most visible representations of the department and our contractor partners' commitment to safety is the training programs that we have for our site personnel. So I'm proud of the Hammer Federal Training Center. We actually have a steering committee meeting tomorrow here in the Tri-Cities to talk more about Hammer and how they're performing, what areas they might need help in. And, again, we'll continue to focus on this as a cornerstone of our ability to attract workers to be part of our Hanford team. They need to know that they're going to be safe here, and the training programs and our commitment to their safety is critical to that. So any questions on base operations at all?
Just a comment that a number of members of the board have had the opportunity to tour some of these facilities recently, and it's been very educational, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, no, we're happy to have you out all the time. I mean, anytime it's people talk about Hanford a lot, and not all of them have been to Hanford. Unless you've been here, you really don't have the perspective on size, scale, the facilities, the passion, and the expertise of the people, the department and contractor partnership. All those elements that make the site successful are hard hard to really understand unless you've been on the site and interface with some of our folks. So, you know, we're happy to get folks out anytime we can to show them what we're doing and how we operate a site of interest in the Pacific Northwest. Last slide is really, it's almost the last slide. There's one more cool picture of our new logo, but we'll get to that. So I would say we have a very positive outlook for 2025 and I'll say beyond. So if you just think about 2025 calendar year, you know, the fiscal year makes things complicated sometimes. We're going to be vitrifying low activity tank waste and all the operations support that this coming calendar year. We'll have shipped the testbed initiative materials to on-site landfill to demonstrate the regulatory process to a grouted waste form that we'll use to retrieve the West Farm tanks in parallel with the work we're doing in the East Farms to retrieve and vitrify. We're transferring waste encapsulation storage facility cesium and strontium capsules from wet storage to dry. The new North Loop that I talked about a few minutes ago will be energized in May, which is tied to a Columbia generating station refilling outage. So that work will be complete. Our new water plant will be in the commissioning process. We'll have completed the contractor transitions to the new contractor at the tank farms. The 324 building, the ERDF supercell, the transuranic waste program, U-Farm retrievals, evaporator ops, and high-level waste design work will be progressing with, again, limited construction in areas where we can do that without any risk of rework. And then we'll continue our focus on the health and safety of our workforce, continue to right-size our infrastructure, and my commitment is continue the engagement processes that we've used to strengthen stakeholder and tribal awareness and relationships, and ultimately continue to strive as a team at Hanford to remain investment worthy for our Congress and continue to serve as the economic foundation of the Tri-Cities and the three-county area. So if you look at that, the view of where we are today and the trajectory we've been able to accomplish over the last several years, including working through a pandemic, lots of reasons to be optimistic. Doesn't mean we're not going to have challenges. Doesn't mean there won't be people that or groups that disagree or have concerns. But at the end of the day, I think we've got a framework and a structure as a One Hanford team and as an enterprise within the Department of Energy with tremendous support from Senator Murray, Senator Cantwell, and congressional members and the congressional delegation, as well as the administration and the secretary, to be positioned for really a spectacular next 10 to 15 years of cleanup. I think people will start to really understand the value of the investments being made at Hanford. So that's really what I wanted to share from an outlook perspective, and entertain any final questions in the last couple of minutes to make sure that the time is valuable for all of you.
Okay, Brian, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. Anyone have any closing comments or questions? Mike?
Could you just elucidate the difference between wet storage and dry storage?
Well, currently the cesium and strontium capsules are sitting in a pool that's about 13 feet deep, which provides the cooling. The half-life of cesium and strontium is about 30 years. So since the time they were in those containers in wet storage, it's been a couple decades. They have decayed to the point where they can go into dry storage in those casks and basically sit there with no water system interface, just being monitored from a temperature perspective, sit there safely and compliantly for decades with no real risk associated with the potential loss of water or any of the other management activities that typically go to wet storage of spent materials. Very similar to what commercial power plants do with spent nuclear fuel. After it's been in a pool for a period of time, it goes into those dry storage casks. Those dry storage casks sit on site for decades with at a very, very low risk, with very little maintenance and costs associated with them. And for us, that means we'll be able to take the investment we've made in WESIF and those dollars and put that into other cleanup work in other places across the site. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mia Burke, will the next life cycle report reflect the congressional funding expectations you were describing earlier? And what I mean is, in the past, the report showed dramatic increases in funding for Hanford cleanup. And I'm curious if that is going to be different than different this year, and it will start to reflect a more flat funding or slightly increased funding, but not dramatic scenario.
I would tell you the report will be put together the same way it's been put together in the past. So, and those reports, you know, there's a template for them and how they're produced. I'm not sure what it will look like yet. They're in the process now of starting to populate it. But it will likely look similar to what it did in the past, based on the current regulatory structure we're in. Again, given the fact that there's 40 milestones in abeyance and those types of things, we're not going to be able to reconcile all that before that report comes out. So I think it'll probably look similar to what it looked like in the past, with funding profiles that are interesting, but probably not realistic.
Okay, well, thank you again, Brian.
Is Brian gonna be sitting through the rest of today's meeting?
I know. Did you hear that question, Brian?
What was the question?
Are you gonna be sitting through the rest of today's meeting?
Oh, no, I got a couple other things I got to do today. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I really appreciate the time. And again, certainly Max, you and the board members can always reach out to ask questions. We're happy to answer your questions anytime.
So I wonder if there's still time, if we can go right to 10:30, if people online have questions, because those questions aren't gonna be answered by Brian at the end of the day.
No, we're going to break now. So, thanks again, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
So we're going to break now until
All right, we're back on.
Okay. Back from break, the next item on the agenda is the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So please, introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope you're having a great week so far. My name is Cass Lasso. I'm a project manager with EPA. I'd like to start off by expressing my gratitude at the opportunity to be here today, give this presentation, meet all of you in person, and learn more about the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board. Just a little bit of history about myself, and also a disclaimer. I'm a new RPM with EPA. I joined the agency earlier this year. I came from
RPM stands for
Remedial Project Manager. And I was previously with the state of Alaska in their Department of Environmental Conservation, Federal Facilities Program. So I came down in May, and now I'm in the Hanford office, working in Hanford. And of course, my colleague Dave Eman is here today with EPA. So I'm filling in for Jeff Schramm today. He was planning on giving this presentation, but he got, stolen to give another presentation today. So I will try to do my best to channel his charismatic public speaking skills. I don't give a lot of public presentations. I'm usually spending 8 hours a day on my computer reading, regulatory documents and responding to emails. So I will be checking my notes quite a bit. All right, so we're talking about the circle process and environmental cleanups on federal facilities. So let's get right into it. CERCLA, it stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. It was created to clean up hazardous waste sites and protect human health and the environment. It defined a national process for how environmental response is conducted in the United States. It is a way to determine who is liable for contamination and also who will pay for the cleanup. It was enacted almost 45 years ago in 1980. And CERCLA is often used synonymously with Superfund, and that is because of the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. This was an amendment that came a couple years after CERCLA in 1946 to just kind of further define some components of CERCLA. And Superfund sites such as Hanford are sites that have been listed on the National Priorities Listing, the NPL list, which are sites that have been designated as a high priority in EPA based on risk and long-term cleanup implications in the Superfund. All right, so why the focus on federal facilities? So federal facilities take up a relatively small portion of the NPL sites. It's roughly about 11% of the Superfund sites. But these sites are often the largest and have a lot of the contamination. And they also are very challenging in terms of cleanup. Hanford is an example. And also to put it in perspective, they do only take up 11% of the NPL sites, but 40% of the operable units or OUs, which are areas of interest, areas of contaminated interest, are in federal facilities. So it's a large amount of contamination. These federal facilities can be former military sites, former munition sites, national laboratories, energy production sites, and they are also very large with a lot of contamination, both in terms of mass, extent. Yep. They are also usually associated with a long operating history, 20, 30, 40 years of site use and continued contamination during that time, which is a factor for the cleanup effort. Examples of the common federal facility RPMs we see, or PRPs, which are potentially responsible parties, are the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the Corps of Engineers, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, so on. All right, so this is just a little visual aid, a map of the federal facility sites on the NPL in the United States. As you can see, they are large sites. They're spread out throughout the country. A lot of them are along coastlines and potentially, sensitive areas. And a lot of them are also in fairly populated areas. So they're affecting a lot of communities.
That map say that Oregon doesn't have any?
Superfund site.
That's not.
There's a tiny little dot, it's really hard to see in Portland, and there's a tiny little dot there.
There is one that's like a light color.
What's the color media?
I should have that, but I do not. So this is just, why the focus on federal facilities, and, EPA also has a specific federal facility section. All right, so the CERCLA's objectives at federal facilities, the key, the CERCLA process is generally the same for federal and non-federal sites, but due to how large these sites are and the impact of contamination and risk, they are often high profile and come with a larger level of community involvement. No one wants a former bombing range or a former nuclear reactor in their backyard, but that is kind of the state of our world. And that's why, the CERCLA objectives and EPA's objectives are collaboration and coordination with the public at all points in the CERCLA stage. Particularly when thinking about reuse of a site, we always want to have the end goal in mind, what the site will eventually be used for. And we want to have that in mind when we're going through the CERCLA process and cleaning up the environment to the levels that it can be used for beneficially. All right. Next slide.
Kind of look the same, don't they? Which one? What's your title?
Roles of federal facilities. All right, so federal facilities, the government is both. What's that?
That's the first one. This is 6.
Slide 6.
Yeah. Roll.
Roles of federal facilities. So unlike non-federal sites, the government is both a potentially responsible party and the regulator. For example, at Hanford, you will hear that DOE is the lead agency and they are also the responsible party. So DOE as the lead agency, they are responsible for managing cleanup and following the CERCLA process. And EPA as the lead regulator for CERCLA actions is responsible for ensuring compliance with the CERCLA process. All right, next slide. While we're talking about compliance with the CERCLA process, we're going to talk about federal facility agreements, or FFAs. This is the legally binding document between the federal facility and EPA or the site. It maps out the responsibilities of the agencies involved to ensure compliance with CERCLA. And it's kind of like the skeleton of how a facility will be managed. It's the brain of how everyone will work together, the budget, the basis for scheduling, stuff like that. States and tribal government provide input on the FFA. And at the Hanford site, the tri-party agreement is the federal facility agreement, of which the Washington State Department of Ecology is a signatory as the third party, the tri-party. And that's pretty common for federal facility agreements where the states be involved. All right, next slide. The cleanup process in CERCLA. So the CERCLA cleanup process, or pipeline as we sometimes call it, for federal sites and non-federal sites is generally the same, but because of the unique factors involved at federal sites, the process can take a lot longer and be much more complex. So this is the pipeline, and we call it a pipeline because it should be a step-by-step process. First this, and then this, and then this, It starts with the site discovery stage. This is identifying a site that may be a risk to human health or the environment. And this is often done by notification to EPA. Once a site is discovered, it goes through the preliminary assessment and site inspection phase. This involves looking at historical records of the site, the former land use, who operated on the site. It often includes visiting the site, boots on the ground, seeing what you can see kind of deal. There's often limited sampling for detect and non-detected contamination to see if contamination is actually present at the site. And it's after this phase that a site can be placed on the national priorities list if it is determined to be a high priority in terms of risk or potentially long-term cleanup actions under the Superfund program. The PASI feeds into the remedial investigation and feasibility study. This is also known as the site characterization stage. So this is the stage with much more extensive sampling and analysis to determine the nature and extent of contamination. There is usually a risk assessment involved to determine the impact, qualitative impact on human health and the environment. So the RI and the FS are conducted concurrently, and the RI eventually feeds into the FS, which is the PRP providing all the different cleanup alternatives that might be an option at the site.
PRP?
Potentially responsible party. Yeah, I'm gonna be using acronyms. I keep trying to define them, but you know, we get caught up in our acronyms, you know. So once the potentially responsible party formulates all these different alternatives, this feeds into the proposed plan, which is part of the RIFS process. This is the preferred alternative that is presented, usually to a public comment period, so everyone can look at it. This proposed plan is based on a variety of factors such as cost, risk mitigation, different things. So the public has an opportunity to comment on it. And all of that process feeds into the ROD, the record of decision. This is also known as the remedy decision. This documents all of the previous steps that has happened at the site. It is a description of the specific response actions that will be taken and thoroughly describes the remedy selected for the cleanup to occur. Now, once we have the remedy and the ROD, this leads to remedial design and remedial action, RDRA. Remedial design is designing the specific cleanup remedy and all the steps that will be involved to implement the remedy. And remedial action is the actual construction or implementation phase of the cleanup. Now, ideally.
So can I ask a question? So the record of decision is more of a high level document. Is that where the remedial design comes after? Is that like the specific details? Wondering sort of how that process stepwise works.
The ROD describes like what the cleanup plan is, and then the RDRA is like work plans of this is what we're gonna do and how we're gonna do it. But the ROD is more high level, yes. Like this is our plan, and then RDRA is this is how we're gonna do it.
Like scope of work.
Yeah, like we often see RDRA work plans and
The ROD says we're gonna dig it up, and the work plan says we're gonna use this brand of shovel.
And it's pretty environmental, I mean, but it's a very legal document that can't be changed.
So that question is, what role does the court play in this process, or when does the court intervene? Is that at the ROD stage?
the court.
Yeah, because typically, I mean, Superfund's always about litigation.
If they
It doesn't have to be.
But if it's a private party, they have to sign a court order as part of the law.
Sorry. So for private sites, the order comes close to from the. Well, it will be entered. And there's two types. There's an agreed order or an unilateral. Order. And it's entered into court, but they actually cannot actually challenge the decision until later. So after the work is done. Right.
So the federal site is different, it's managed the same.
The same, other than the federal facility agreement is already in place. In our case, it's the federal facility detention center. So that's already in place.
Okay, so that's at a higher level with RODs for both. Okay, thank you. Mike?
I have to ask the question because of this environment that we're in. If this concept of a unitary executive is actually adopted, and both the EPA and the DOE are now reporting back to one guy eating cheeseburgers in the White House. Ken, hypothetical, yes. And he decides that this isn't something that he really wants to put money on. What recourse do the public, in this case, I guess the state of Washington, have? Do you have access to the report?
Yeah, I've reported super.
Six, three, Supreme Court.
Sorry for that tangent.
No, lovely questions. And that is why Dave is here. Moral support. I will say I don't have a lot of experience on private sites. I worked primarily with federal and environmental work. I will say also the RODs generally have legal sections that say if a party does want to take legal action, this is how they will do it. All right, back to the circular pipeline.
Quick, one more question, sorry.
Yeah.
Where does this schedule get established in this process?
There is a very general schedule in the ROD. And then it is the RA work plans that's where the actual schedule is much more defined, ideally.
And we're working on the now the Portland Farmers Superfund site remedial design, and they're coming in from the different PRPs. So the community has a hot minute to go over them with the help of the technical advisor and to see how they're going to conduct their part of it. We can give advice, but we can't really change anything. Nonetheless, it gives us an idea of how they're doing business all the way down.
There's something similar when it's a federal facility as well, and there's a similar sort of opportunity for people to learn about it, review and.
Well, that's the question.
That's the proposed plan.
Yeah.
Is there a community group like we have that works with the technical advisor that looks at how this is progressing?
I'm not sure.
I've never been sure about this super.
There are certainly a lot of technical people. You know, ecology has technical people.
Right. But you're not part of Team Hanford as Brian Hanson. They make a case for all right.
No, yeah.
They're rigging.
We are all are in this together, but we are separate also.
Different rules of the same.
Different roles. All right, so the circular pipeline, ideally we get to site completion and long-term maintenance and monitoring. This happens when all physical cleanup is complete. So either this means cleanup goals have been met and a site is protective of human health and the environment. And if the site was put on the NPL, then it is taken off the NPL and unrestricted use and exposure is allowed. More often we see that physical cleanup will reach a stage of completion, but final cleanup levels may not be achieved everywhere on the site, resulting in long-term monitoring and maintenance. This might mean enforcing institutional controls or land use controls, long-term site restrictions, or maybe continued groundwater treatment to remove groundwater contaminants, or continued groundwater monitoring to see, how the levels are changing over time and to eventually reach a stage where the site is appropriate to be used for all uses. All right, next slide. All right, so that was a lot of talking. So here is a figure that I clearly stole from ecology to just kind of sum it up. Of note, everything circular at Hanford is past that assessment stage. The assessment stage is where you determine if a site is going to be placed on the NPL. There are 4 NPL sites on Hanford, the 100, 200, 300, and the 1100 area, which is now deleted. And another important to note is that community involvement in planning is an integral part of the entire circular process from the beginning to the end. All right, I am going to take a step back now to the ROD because it is very important. So I kind of talked about how the FFA is the skeleton of the facility and it's important for structure, but the ROD is the body, the muscle of the site. It's kind of a gross analogy. It's the only thing I could think of. But the FFA is the framework and the ROD is what actually moves the body, moves the site to clean up. So it is the decision document that formalizes the cleanup plan. It aligns with all regulatory standards and ARAR's appropriate and relevant requirements, the federal and state regulations, and the best available science at the time. It ensures the public involvement and transparency in the circular process. It is a roadmap to clean up for the site, beginning with the design and the action, and to long-term remediation and cleanup. So while rods are the defining dock for cleanup and they are a legal document and they can't be changed, there is a little bit of flexibility surrounding them. We often see interim rods, which are a pre-rod document that we don't quite have enough information for a site to establish a final remedy, but we know there needs to be an interim remedy in place. So we put in an interim rod so that the site can risk can be mitigated while we reach a final rod. There's also rod amendments. This is a post-rod document where if something comes up that changes the remedy, such as, we have cleanup levels in the rod that we need to meet, and then the cleanup levels are lowered. We need to look back at the rod, see if those cleanup levels are still protective. If they're not, or if it changes the remedy, we can document that in the rod amendment. But just to sum up, the rod is the cornerstone of the circular process. Next slide. All right, so key documents and circular timelines.
Question for you on how many active rods are there?
That's in one of my later slides. Let me see,
That's a.
8 of them. Not including interim rods and rod amendments. So because of the complexity of federal facilities, decision-making at these sites can take a bit longer, as we've seen. The total process should be between 4 to 10 years. Ideally, we want 1 year for each stage in the rod process. It can take a lot longer. There's sites at Hanford that are far beyond that timeline. For federal facilities specifically, there's factors involved such as, politics and funding from Congress. So those affect the timelines as well. Next slide.
Sorry. Would you rather we save questions for the end? Would look better for you?
I like them while they're happening. Some of them will come up later, but I can just say them now.
I'm just curious in the process. Let's say there's a site where there's something like emergent happening or something that has like a time sensitive angle to it.
Yeah.
Is there a way under CERCLA that some remediation can start happening while this is going on? It's like really obvious that like this thing right here, you need to deal with right this second, no matter what else happens. Or...
Yeah, so that's called the time critical removal action. So that's generally a removal action that needs to happen within 10 months. I think 10 months is it. And then anything beyond that is called a non-time critical removal action. And that's also something that can happen before the rod process reaches it. And so that's like, we need to dig up this dirt now. We have to do something in place. But it's not quite significant enough to be an interim rod because it's not a remedy. It's more of an action occurring.
I have a question about reopening a rod, and it's related to 324 building, just as an example. Who decides to reopen a rod? And in that decision, why is it just focused, like the rod is very large, not just 324 building. Why is reopening the rod just focusing on 324 building and not looking at the whole picture of the rod and the other sites that are in it?
From my experience, and I might need Dave's help on this, reopening a rod is not something that we do. It might be possible, but
It is possible, and it just depends on what the scope, the interest of what the focus at the time. In the case of 324, that was the emergent issue, and as Casper alluded to earlier, there's various types of rod changes. There's insignificant changes, significant changes, and then fundamental changes. We determined that the change that energy was proposed and we felt was necessary for 324 was a fundamental change to the trim. So that's why that is a rod item. It's not something that's just done willy-nilly because it's the same burden as doing the first effort, right? So it's not something one wants to do just because. In this case, it was significant and the question was real. So we said, yes, let's investigate that. Other times we do just smaller changes. There were ESDs to change the location of the waste storage. So there's small things.
ESP's explanation is a bit different.
Thank you.
And on that note, one over in Oregon, but the only Congress woman that was very using Hanford is just about one circular process. When it came to Hanford, and then the big thing about, right now that I think for the continuing report about how you mentioned regulatory, how has your regulatory, have they been diminished, all this process when it comes to this, because I guess you make a recommendation, also in the state of Washington, right? Like with this, and the whole process that goes into the public, right? And your regulatory powers that you're to together finish all this process. Making these comments.
No, I think, obviously, I think Brian said, no one then does this just willy-nilly, right? It has to be significant. And, that particular project is not in my office, it's in my director office, it's for Constable Recovery Act, and those things. But they felt that we could get him to make it on it. It felt that the GAO was making inappropriate recommendations.
So could be looking at pension reports and stuff or something.
Oh, you're limited. Dropping the L. All right. Folks online, we're having a hard time hearing the back of the room, so we're trying to make sure when you're talking to the L.
I just wanted to add, it's rare that my Superfund experience ever comes into superintendent. But, in the Portland Harbor Superfund study, ends up with hiring, it's reclassified to our constellation. And still, and, given that we're worried about reclassification of rates, I wonder.
So I guess the question is on waste classification.
Changes there too.
And yeah, it changes. And in the case of Hanford, I think the principle is the difference between low activity waste and high level waste. So if you could frame that question as to who makes that decision and how that decision is made in terms of waste classifications.
I'm not entirely sure I can answer that question in a way that would be.
Or we could hold it for college.
Actually, I have another question, kind of related to this.
I mean, in terms of waste classification, there's a couple different things. Let's back really quick to the Bentley firing. That was I'm not super familiar with it, but I do know that was related to a change in the toxicity information
Yes.
that implied it was actually less toxic than we did believe.
Yes.
There's going to be a similar issue, but different than flip-flop at Hanford, and that is for hexavalent chromium. It is more hazardous than now cancer by ingestion, really. So we're going to have to be looking at our decisions particularly along the river, where oh boy, hexavalent chromium had been released as to whether we need to change those. So that's one topic. In terms of classification of waste, whether it's high level or low level, that is the Department of Energy's authority.
They're self-regulating on radioactive materials.
So the way that would interact with rods of surplus and things is the rod might say something like high level waste has to be in X, Y, or Z situation at this level, but what counts as high or low is not defined by the rod or by surplus. That's defined by DOE saying this is.
We would say if it's high level waste, that has to go to deep geologic repository, cannot stay on site.
Right.
But we can't say what is or isn't high level.
So would that
We can
typically be
figure
listed
it
as an AROR then? All right, AROR, you have
Applicable, yeah.
And then just a little side note, it's applicable or relevant and appropriate. So it can be an applicable requirement or it can be relevant and appropriate. So it has to meet two criteria over here to be a standard, only one of them. So
They are, they are,
A-R, A-R, A-R.
they are.
So I have a question. At Hanford site, early on, you said the assessment has basically been completed. But much of the assessment included comparable sites so that you did the site characterization in one place. And then in various other areas that were similar, they just said, we don't need to do site characterization there. We're gonna just assume that they're comparable and we'll treat them the same. So in now with sort of changes in the way that in the way we define hazardous waste, but in sort of knowledge about toxicity, has that affected those comparable sites and the assumptions that were made?
Not so much because the assessment led to establishing the NPL sites, right? Like the 100, 200. So the 200 area is big and there's still characterization that needs to occur in the 200 area. And, you know, they're using comparable sites to do that. But I'm not sure how to answer.
So the assessment process is what gets you into the NPL. That there's still lots of characterization that has to happen after the assessment is done.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to sort of throw the whole comparable site discussion into the whole discussion about what's happening at Hanford in particular, because there are a lot of places that really don't have that initial soil sampling because they're assumed to be comparable to this other place, right?
Yes, and so that also ties into why the timelines for the rods have been a lot longer. You know, we're not saying, oh, this is the remedy for the site because you still need to characterize this other site, or you're saying it's similar, but you need to sample it to prove that it's similar and that a remedy would be the same at those two areas. So that kind of ties into the timeframes of the rod and the work that's been going on.
So we've got about 12 minutes or so left, so we're going to have to try to restrain ourselves from tangential questions. It's so hard. Yeah. So please proceed.
There's a lot of rabbit holes in Circle, I tell you what. Okay, next slide, I think. So circular challenges, we've talked about some of them already. Federal facilities pose unique challenges for cleanup. A big part of this is the complex contamination issues, usually multiple types of contamination over large areas, high and mid and low concentrations, present in different media. You know, you got soil, vadosome, groundwater, surface water. You got the tumbleweeds going over the desert, spreading soil around. A remedy for one contaminant might not be applicable or appropriate for another co-located contaminant. So you need to think about, well, are you gonna have two remedies in the same area for two different contaminants? That's more expensive. Is that feasible? Should we wait to see what these contaminants are doing? Is one a higher risk than the other one? The radiological contamination at Hanford specifically, there's considerations for the behavior in the environment, including persistency and disposal factors. You know, the disposal of rad is expensive or not highly feasible sometimes. Another challenge is the size of the site. Hanford is 580 square miles. I pulled that off of Google AI, so I hope it's right. It sounds right. And the high cost. You know, we talked about the longer time frames, and that is dependent from funding from Congress. And not so much a challenge, but something we're thinking about throughout the circle process is interagency coordination, making sure there's clear lines of coordination and communication between the federal and state agencies, the tribes, the community, the public at large, interest groups. And for Hanford, you know, that's everyone along the Columbia River. Columbia River is a long river. All right, next slide. So unlike non-federal sites, which are generally funded by the responsible party, federal facilities are funded by federal budgets. So the lead agency, which is usually the responsible party, is responsible for allocating the plan for these funds and submitting the budgets to Congress, and they have to be approved by Congress. And these cleanups can range into the billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions. You know, the timeframes are long, the cost is big, and the area is big. So these are big budgets. So as such, EPA and the lead agency are responsible for ensuring these taxpayer funds are spent responsibly, both to ensure protection of human health and the environment, and to remain transparent and accountable to the public for the spending of these funds. Next slide. Tribal governments at federal facilities. So there are many provisions within CERCLA that ensure tribes are involved in the decision-making process, particularly when tribal lands and resources are impacted by contamination and or remedial actions that might occur. Tribes also have a unique legal status under CERCLA where they are kind of treated similar to states. It provides distinct rights to reflect their governmental authority and their cultural connection to our natural resources. Next slide. Community involvement. CERCLA also provides provisions to involve the public in the CERCLA process. It is required at key steps such as the proposed plan, the ROD, and all decision documents. These are done by public comment periods, which are generally 30 days, but they can be longer and extended. And community advisory groups, such as this one, are often formed to represent certain communities, issues, priorities, and interests, and to shape how the cleanups are performed at federal facilities. All right, so we talked a lot about CERCLA, talked a lot about federal facilities. Let's zone into Hanford now. So complex and long-term cleanup is happening. It is one of the most contaminated nuclear sites in the world. Due to the size of the site, the variety of contamination, you got the tanks and you have all the different medias. The radiological contaminants particularly poses long-term cleanup and disposal challenges. The facility was established in 1943, over 80 years ago. So that's a long operating history and already a long cleanup timeframe that we have at Hanford. There's the 4 NPL sites. In these NPL sites, there are currently 31 operable units, and all of which are individually following that CERCLA pipeline. 8 record of decisions have been established, and these are not including the interim RODs and the ROD amendments, which there are a lot more of those. And cleanup at Hanford requires integrating CERCLA with RCRA and also the Washington Administrative Code regulations. So that is something that we're thinking about. And much, so the legacy and the cleanup to date kind of just illustrates like the challenges of cleanups at federal facilities. Hanford continued. There's a couple of these continued slides. So in the past 30 years, the priority has been along the river corridor, the 100 and 300 areas. It includes 1,300 waste sites being cleaned up, almost 900 facilities being disposed and demolished. Several reactors in place in cold and dark status, 19 million tons of contaminated soil being placed on the landfills on site, and 30 billions of contaminated groundwater being treated on site at the pump and treat facilities on Hanford. But lots of work remains. There's an estimated 700 remaining waste sites and facilities. This is estimated. The operation of the pump and treat facilities will continue long into the future to treat that groundwater. And of course, looking at the long-term management of wastes and waste streams at Hanford. All right, so looking ahead, both at all federal facilities and at Hanford, our priority is utilizing the best available science and technologies to continue refining remedies to ensure that they are protecting human health and the environment in the most efficient way. There's also an increased focus on emerging contaminants, such as PFAS. That's been, a big priority lately. And that's because our process of identifying and understanding risk is always evolving. 30 years ago, we didn't know what PFAS did to our bodies. We didn't know the risk involved. And it wasn't until recently that we even established PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. So as our understanding of risk evolves, we're looking at remedies that are in place and making sure they're still effective. Also continued collaboration and consultation with tribal governments, the public, and interest groups. A big part of that is fostering transparent and productive relationships. a big part of looking ahead in CERCLA is the 5-year review process to evaluate the progress of sites and if any changes to the remedy are needed. The 5-year review is also a mechanism to look at emerging contaminants, you know, and be like, hey, this wasn't a contaminant during the last 5-year review. Was it used historically at the site? Do we need to look at it now? Do we need to look at how it may impact the remedy? And of course, always looking at long-term stewardship of the site, whether that means being cleaned up completely or managed in a way that makes it protected for human health and the environment. All right, last slide. Main takeaway, federal facility cleanups under CERCLA are challenging, they are costly, they are complex, and they are long. They require continued coordination between all agencies, the tribe and the public. And as with Hanford, decades of cleanup work have already occurred and remain ahead of us also. And our priority is to oversee cleanup within the framework of CERCLA and ensure the protection of human health and the environment. And I will be happy to try to answer any questions you have.
So if you drop a random pin on the map of the Hanford site, what determines whether EPA or ecology is regulating that particular issue, wherever it is?
Something I found out fairly recently is that Hanford has been kind of divvied up to, do you say ecology and EPA?
Yes.
So there's the lead regulator approach where ecology is the lead regulator for some areas and EPA is the lead regulator for some areas. Part of that determines like if there's more